Hey guys, Argent here. This is a request video for a friend of mine, Andrew, who runs West Coast Reactionaries. Highly recommend you go over and check it out. Adam Wallace posts there and some other good guys. So, Andrew was reading a bit about Mao Zedong, and he thought there was a lot of important lessons we could take from him, a lot of important strategies. And frankly, I agree. I just like to say as a disclaimer, Mao is arguably the worst person in human history. The only people who kind of come close are like Tamerlane, Stalin, I won't touch the Hitler thing, and Pol Pot are kind of the only people I can think of off the top of my head who come close. So I don't want this to seem like I'm celebrating Mao. I have respect for him as a politician, as a military commander, and for kind of his career. As a human being, though, I kind of hope he's in hell. But let's go on. So before we actually get to Mao, I'm going to have to do a bunch of Chinese history. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm probably going to get some of this wrong. That's not because I haven't studied it or, tried to get it right. It's just that modern Chinese history is really complicated. And I don't say that like some Valley girls like, oh man, this history stuff's really complicated. It just is. Particularly after the period we're talking about, no one really knew which side people were on. You had warlords running all over the place. No one knew whose side they were on. People switched sides all the time. There was theoretical governments, but they didn't really have much power. So, as far as I can determine, modern China really starts with the Taiping Rebellion. Now, the Taiping Rebellion was, I believe, let me just double check. Yes, memory does serve correctly. The Taiping Rebellion was the 1850s to the mid-1860s. Now, the Taiping Rebellion was led by, I believe his name was Hong something or other, and he was converted by Christian missionaries to this really strange version of Christianity. He didn't really understand the Trinity, so he believed that he was the third person of the Trinity, or he called himself the younger brother of Jesus. So he set up a vaguely Christian socialist state, which was just kind of a totalitarian military republic. Military totalitarian kingdom, and all their energy was just focused on the army. And they were able to build a very well-organized, disciplined, professional army in a very short period of time. Now, China at the time was ruled by the Ching Dynasty, which had been in sharp decline for years, and they proved completely incapable of even attempting to deal with the Taiping Rebellion. Their armies got completely trashed. And ultimately what happened was local elites across China raised their own armies. You had them raise they called them scholar gentry, scholar bureaucrats, or the mandarins, raised their local armies, which proved to be a lot better than the Qing Dynasty's armies, and they succeeded eventually after a long war of putting the Taiping Rebellion down. What it meant, though, was that the dominant military power in China had shifted from the government to the warlords. Over time, though, the Qing developed something called the self-strengthening movement, where they tried to modernize. Now, this largely didn't work, but they were able to produce the Beiying, I think it's Beiying, let me see, what's it called? Beiyang, I think is how you pronounce it, army, which was under the leadership of General Yang Shikai, which was an army of 500,000 well-trained, modernly equipped soldiers who were trained and equipped in Western style. So things kind of went on and on. The Qing Dynasty was planning on implementing a constitutional monarchy, a bit like either Germany, which had a bit more power for the emperor, or like the United Kingdom. But the nationalists and the various social movements in China felt things were moving too slowly, and that China wasn't going to go the way of Japan, because in Japan the emperor had defeated the, I guess you could call them the ultra-reactionary warlords, and had rapidly modernized Japan, turning it into a modern, I guess you could say, nationalistic major power. And they kind of wanted to do something like that. So you had a generation of Western-educated elites like Sun Yat-sen, who had lived in America. Actually, Sun Yat-sen had converted to Christianity, I think Congregationalism. And he said, well, I'll just take what they did in Western countries and apply it to China. We want a modern, scientifically run, centralized nation state like the kind they have in Western countries. We have to kind of end the extreme regionalism that plagues China. So he negotiated with Yang Shikai, the head of the Beiyang army, and basically the deal they eventually cut was they would overthrow the Ching Dynasty, and in exchange Yang Shikai would become the president of the Republic of China. So that happened. You kind of had two governments for a while. You had the Beijing government under the leadership of Yang Shikai, and the Nanking government under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. So that all happened. Eventually, Yang Shikai tried to make himself emperor, but this failed, and it resulted in his death. After Yang Shikai died, the Beiyang army broke apart and was no longer able to maintain any kind of control over the country. Large sections of it defected to various warlords. Without any kind of central large opposition, warlords sprung up all across China, and the vast majority of the country was run as a warlord state. The Beijing government still had the international recognition, though. And this is kind of where we start to enter Mao. So at this point in time, we have kind of two main factions in China other than the warlords and the Beiyang army. We have the Kuomintang. I'm anglicizing it. I think it's actually pronounced Kuomintang, but I have always pronounced it Kuomintang because I'm a Anglo and I can't pronounce other languages for shit. So you had the Kuomintang or Nationalist Party, and you had the Communist Party. Now the Communist Party was much, much smaller. So they initially decided we'll all join the Kuomintang, and when we're part of that, we can influence it from within. And this was something that, and Mao enters the scene, and I'll talk a bit about Mao in a minute. Sorry this took so long. You can also kind of consider this a brief political history of China, of modern China. So Mao advocated that all the Communist Party members would join the Kuomintang and take over it from within and try to push it leftward. And initially they were welcomed because Sun Yat-sen was, and a lot of the leadership was amenable to socialism. The Kuomintang always kind of maintained some aspects of it. Like, for instance, the army was called the National Revolutionary Army up until the end of the war. And we'd have frequent periods where they'd be in alliance against the Japanese or against the warlords. So, who is Mao Zedong? He came from, I think it's Hunan, or it's a province in southern China, southeastern China, I believe. So he was born to I believe you could call them a lower middle class family, and he was a school teacher and a librarian. So what can we say about Mao personally? Mao personally was an extremely cold man. His two major hobbies, as we'll see throughout his life, were swimming and reading. Mao was a great lover of books. It was almost an addiction. After he became premier and he started to ban other sources of knowledge, they started to ban a lot of the classics, a lot of other things. He would order every copy but one of books destroyed, and he had a library of the last copy of the book because he liked to read them. His other great love was swimming, and this was kind of the theme of his life. How he liked to swim was just to float in the water. And that kind of, I think, summarizes a lot of his political philosophy and his military philosophy. He was a man who just ultimately liked to float. And he would continue to float despite all his opponents. And I believe it's in the book Mao the Untold Story, but it said, and I'm trying to recall this from memory because I couldn't find it in the book, floating summarized Mao. Regardless of what happened, regardless of how chaotic China got, he was always able to float. His opponents were warlords, militarists, kings, and Western powers, but in the end he continued to float while one after one they sunk to the bottom. So Mao became the leader of the local Communist Party, and he advocated joining the Kuomintang. So Mao was actually briefly part of the Nationalist Party. So Sun Yat-sen's ideology was the three principles of the people, which were democracy, nationalism, and the livelihood of the common working people. The third one can be interpreted either as socialism or some form of corporatism, depending on which group it is. So the communists and nationalists joined together in a united front and marched north, and they were able to overthrow the Bangyang clique. They were able to defeat some of the larger warlord groups and establish a government in Nanking, which would remain the internationally recognized government of the Republic of China. Around this time, we have Chiang Kai-shek, who became the supreme leader of the Kuomintang, and he was a rightist. And this is kind of, we're getting into the bizarre nature of the Kuomintang and part of the reason why they collapsed. The Kuomintang was never a united group. You had a large left-wing faction, some of whom were kind of nationalist and socialist. I don't mean national socialist, I mean they were nationalist but also had socialist ideas. There you had liberals, like kind of Western-style liberal democracy advocates. You had conservatives who weren't imperialists, but they believed in a lot of other stuff. And you had kind of like the right of the party, which was Chiang Kai-shek, who kind of, people describe his ideology as being Confucian fascism, which I don't think is a bad way of describing it. A lot of the Kuomintang believed in some form of traditionalist China, but they saw the Qing as being a foreign-imposed dynasty, and there's a need to modernize China in order to preserve it from outside influence. So you had this mess of people that tried to unite every aspect of Chinese society, but ultimately it didn't really please anyone. And it suffered from a complete lack of discipline, a lack of ideological cohesion. Due to its size, they had to make a lot of deals. They had to look the other way on a lot of corruption. So when Chiang Kai-shek became leader of the party, he purged the communists and most of the far-left elements out of the party. And Mao and the rest of the communists left. And then this begins kind of the first phase of the Chinese Civil War, where Mao was able to establish the Chinese Soviet Republic in the southeast part of the country. He gradually, basically what happened was after the purge, a bunch of Kuomintang regiments defected. Mao and some of the other communist leaders were able to gain the loyalty of these regiments, and they were able to set up a socialist republic in southeastern China. Now, it was around this time that Mao kind of came to a realization. You see, Stalinism and Leninism had a focus on the urban proletariat, the working class. China didn't have a working class because it didn't have industry. So Mao decided, okay, we need to have the peasantry on our side because they're the average person, and the Kuomintang, which was rightist, tended to favor the landowners and kind of the urban class, which was a much smaller part of the population. So Mao began a number of, throughout his, and this was kind of one of the core themes of his life, he imposed very strict discipline on his army. And I think the discipline the communists had was ultimately what won out. Within any area that Mao occupied throughout the Civil War, soldiers were not permitted to loot from the common people. They didn't loot from the peasants. If anything, whenever they would take money or take land from the landlords or the kind of the wealthier people, they would distribute part of it not only to their troops but to the local peasants. They would help to feed the peasants. They would do literacy campaigns. They would help them develop more agriculture. They were always very keen on serving the peasantry, which kind of set Mao apart from the other leaders, which were focused on the urban areas. So the peasantry, having good relations with them, helped the army to hide. The peasants would provide them with crops. It, of course, provided a lot of recruits. Perhaps most importantly, though, it provided them with a lot of spies. The peasantry existed all throughout China, and when they were kind of on the communist side, they would pass information along. The rigid discipline of the various socialist republics also meant that there was very little corruption. Now, I think we have to analyze a bit what I mean by corruption. While Mao was fairly arbitrary in his power and he lived a fairly lavish lifestyle, the Communist Party didn't really redirect a lot of the money into their own pockets. Because it was a socialist republic, they didn't really have much use for money. So virtually the entire production of the various communist states went directly into industry, intelligence, and military. A common problem with the Kuomintang was that corrupt local warlords would often sell weapons to the communists, or they'd sell them to bandits or stuff like that. The Kuomintang received a ton of international aid from Western countries who were anti-communist, but a lot of it wound up going to the Communist Party or warlords, etc. A lot of the local Kuomintang governors were extremely corrupt and were basically warlords who flew a Republic of China flag. And they were largely unable to deal with any of these things. So within kind of the Socialist Republic, Mao was able to, briefly before he kind of got overruled, to conduct guerrilla warfare. They had their own state, but China's really, really big and transportation wasn't very good. So they were able to use guerrilla warfare. So the Nationalist Army would basically penetrate in, and then the guerrillas would go and cut their supply lines, like blow up their supply depots, cut the rail lines, cut the telephone wires. And basically the Nationalists would have to retreat because they had no food. They didn't have like motorized transportation. They didn't really even have horses. So they'd have to walk all the way through this large communist state without any supplies, which is basically impossible. And the troops were very poorly disciplined. The actual Kuomintang army was not bad. They were actually a lot better trained and equipped than a lot of the communist troops, but they were only a small part of it, and they were mainly relying on all these warlords. So ultimately what happened is, with a lot of German assistance, the Kuomintang was able to surround the Red State, and they had a big strategy where they just built fortifications around and tried to starve it in submission. So Mao took command of about half, a third of the Red Army, and broke out by attacking one of the warlords, who was unwilling to risk his own men and risk kind of lowering his because if he loses his men, then he loses position. So he just kind of let the communists escape. So this began the Long March, in which I believe it was like 50,000 communist soldiers under Mao's leadership marched all the way up from southeastern China to southwestern China. Now the book Mao the Untold Story says that Mao deliberately prolonged the Great March to kill until most of the opposing Communist Party leadership had either died off or come to accept his absolute power. His main rival in the army had been leading the other army column, but when he met up with Mao, he had far fewer troops and was ultimately had to take second fiddle to Mao for the rest of the war. So Mao had lost about 80% of his army, but that didn't really matter because the remaining 7,000 were completely battle-hardened. They were fanatical. They were completely willing to die. All the factionalism had basically been wiped out. All opposing leadership was basically wiped out. The entire Chinese Communist Party, and indeed the entire movement, was under Mao's personal rule. Any form of corruption, any form of harassing the peasants, any lack of discipline was completely destroyed. There was complete coherence to the party's ideology and policy. Granted, Mao was often arbitrary, but the second Red State was, while totalitarian, it was a lot more functional than the rest of China. Because of the extreme discipline, the Communists had an extremely useful strategy, which actually was part of the reason they escaped the first time, of planting dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of moles within the nationalist government. The nationalist government had so much turnover and was so desperate for leadership, they were willing to basically take anyone in without background checks. So a number of the general staff and like people who operated out of Chiang Kai-shek's office were communist infiltrators. So everything the nationalists did was completely broadcast to the communists, and that combined with their general incompetence made it extremely difficult. Tamerlane had a saying, it's better to have 100 men here than 10,000 who are not. And that was kind of how the communists worked. The vast majority of the communist troops were extremely well disciplined. They wouldn't retreat. They'd fight to the death. And the nationalist army just wasn't willing to really die for Chiang Kai-shek's war. So they would lose battles where they were outnumbered 5 to 10 to 1 because the communists wouldn't break. And you had all this corruption, etc. And they had Soviet aid. So just the extreme discipline, the infiltrating their opponents, the coherency of vision were all very important things. So then Mao's next strategy was basically to turn his enemies against each other. Now this is controversial, but it's widely believed that, I believe it was in Shanghai, where a Japanese officer was shot by a Chinese officer, or it was something like that. But it's strongly believed that there's a couple false flags in which communist infiltrators in the Kuomintang stirred shit up with the Japanese. During the Marco Polo Bridge incident, it's believed that generals in the Kuomintang sympathetic to the communists escalated the whole affair. And complete war broke out. Now, the communists held a relatively small area that was well fortified and mountainous, whereas the Kuomintang and the warlords theoretically controlled the rest of China. So who are you going to attack if you're the Japanese? Are you going to throw all your troops against this small fortified area that doesn't have much resources, or are you going to go and take the bigger prize? So the Japanese ran large portions of China. The nationalists had a large army that had been trained by Germans to German standards, which is immensely useful in China, but they got slaughtered because the Japanese had the Chinese had a big army. They didn't have very many good troops. So they got slaughtered. They lost a lot of their airplanes, their tanks. They gradually just had to resort to recruiting people and arming them with pikes and shit. So the nationalist army was just bled dry, and the Japanese were also being bled dry. So what the communists did was they started to conduct low-level harassment raids against weak Japanese positions, which really didn't have much effect in the overall war effort, but it gave the impression that they were doing something and that they were fighting for the people. And they took every opportunity to blame the failures of the war and to blame the inability to achieve any sort of victory on the Japanese on the Kuomintang. So as the war carried on, the communists largely stayed out of it. They just built up their army. They took bits of territory. When they could, they stole military equipment from both sides. They got some support from the Soviet Union, and they just waited, knowing that sooner or later one side was going to win, and they would go in and take out whoever was weakest at the end of the process. So eventually, the Allies defeated the Japanese, and the Chinese were forced to the Japanese withdrew from Manchuria, and while the nationalists took most of Manchuria, the communists were able to get a lot of the weapons out. So then the Chinese Civil War restarted in earnest. The nationalists had completely overrun Manchuria, but their supply lines were extremely thin, and the communist state was between Manchuria and the rest of China. So Mao ordered his troops to cut off the supply lines, and once the supply lines were cut off, they besieged most of the cities in Manchuria and were able to get hundreds of thousands of nationalist troops to surrender. By this point in time, the propaganda, the offering food, education, and all kinds of things to the peasantry had turned them against the Kuomintang. A lot of Kuomintang armies found themselves incapable of getting any kind of logistical support. Peasants harassed and prevented supplies from being transported. They wouldn't sell them grain. They basically just controlled the cities, which were these isolated pockets, and the communists were able to pretty easily siege them. So as time went on, more and more warlords started to defect to Mao and started to defect to the communist state, and more Kuomintang generals gave up. And as their troops deserted, they continued to join the communist army. And as they advanced, they tried as little as possible to harass the peasantry and focused all their wrath against the landlords. So eventually, despite having, I guess, like 10 times the army and having, I guess, like hundreds of times the amount of firepower, the nationalists collapsed in a couple short years, and the remaining people fled to Taiwan, which is where the remaining Kuomintang members live to this day. And Mao became the dictator of all of China. So he had gone from, in a span of a couple decades, from having 6,000 communist soldiers to becoming the leader of the most populated country on earth and defeating an opponent whose army numbered in the millions. So what are the kind of the core lessons of this? Number one, survival is paramount. You can't win the war if you're dead. It's generally better to retreat and to try to conserve whatever strength you can than to die in a pitched battle you can't win. The communists retreated all sorts of times and were unwilling to throw their full weight into battle. They realized that so long as they could maintain at least some degree of their forces, they would always be able to fight and to wait for a better opportunity. That's number one. Number two, they did not interrupt when their opponents were destroying each other. In fact, they tried to foment destruction, foment their opponents to fight one another, including directly kind of infiltrating their opponents and getting them to just fight. And meanwhile focusing on building up their own forces and striking when one of their opponents had exhausted the other one. That's kind of, I guess, thing number two. Number three, taking advantage of the chaos of your opponents and their arrogance. This is done by infiltrating them. Now, it was pretty easy to do because they were arrogant, so long as you made some vaguely nationalistic sentiments and some vaguely kind of populist statements, then they'd let you join. So I think, hopefully, I'm not going to go into super detail, but I think you can see kind of where this is going and how this would be relevant to our movement. Number four, I think we're on. Discipline is paramount. Everyone has to stay on message. Everyone has to not just go ape shit and has to just stay on the level. People can't pillage the peasantry. People can't attack the general public. They have to focus on winning the support of the average person and turning them against the leadership of your enemies. If you can start to discredit and destroy the leadership of your enemies, the public will start to defect to you. Now, you have to be very careful that you don't get completely watered down. And this is where the idea of a vanguard party comes in. The communists always had a vanguard party. These are highly disciplined, highly educated, highly trained people who will fight to the death. And they need to stay the core leadership, and you can't have that diluted as people come over to you. The main goal of having people come over to you is not so much to strengthen yourself, but to weaken your enemies. So you focus on creating confusion, infiltrating, and destroying the leadership of your opponents, because if you cut off the head, the body will die. Regardless of how you feel about them, you need the public support. And the public support can be very easy to... It's more easy to win than you want. Also, you always have to blame the opposition for anything that goes wrong. Discrediting them is extremely important. Let's see here. Number 5. I guess just quality often beats quantity. Having 10,000 men who are willing to die and willing to fight to the death for a cause can beat 1 million people who are completely unwilling to sacrifice anything. And we've seen this again and again in history. Most revolutions only have about 1 to 5% of the population involved. Revolution's a middle class game. The average person, generally speaking, won't fight or won't get involved. They'll just kind of do what they're told. And that's kind of something that emerged in China. Let's see here. It can be used... So I think those are just kind of some basic points. I guess overall I can summarize it as survive, discipline, and get your enemies to destroy themselves, and to not stop them when they're having infighting or they're fighting against someone else. And I think with a little thought, we can apply a lot of these to our movement and to our strategies. So I'm sorry that this video was so long, but there was a lot of shit to cover. So I hope you enjoyed it. More stuff to come. This is Argent. I'll talk to you guys later.